Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we are streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube. You can watch those videos anytime afterward on those platforms as well. And if you have not already silenced your phones, please do so now. At 5 p.m. tomorrow, Thursday, April 27th, the museums will have History Happy Hour, a free program featuring live music by Fred T. and the Band, food from 2 for $7 Kitchen, Eddie Wright Barbecue, Fratelli Italian Ice, and Howlin' Mal's. Flash tours through the museums will focus on the state's musical history, so I hope that you'll come back for that. And as well, the exhibit Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley Let the World See is open upstairs and runs through May 14th. Admission to the exhibit is included with your tickets to these museums. And remember that History's Lunch attendees can visit the museums and exhibit free of charge after our program. Next week's History's Lunch is in conjunction with that exhibit and will feature Davis Houck presenting A Lynching Post Facto, Emmett Till and the Mississippi Press in 1955. The next day, Mississippi author Linda Williams Jackson will give a gallery talk upstairs and discuss how she transformed the facts surrounding Till's murder into her award-winning middle-grade novel, Midnight Without a Moon. That free event will be at 11 o'clock, so please come back for those. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Devery S. Anderson to discuss his new book, A Slow, Calculated Lynching, The Story of Clyde Kennard. Devery Anderson earned a BA in History from the University of Utah and an MA in Publishing from George Washington University. His book, Emmett Till, The Murder That Shocked the World and Propelled the Civil Rights Movement, was published in 2015 by the University Press of Mississippi and is the basis for the ABC TV series Women of the Movement. Anderson is marketing manager for Signature Books in Salt Lake City and the editor or co-editor of 4 books related to Mormons in the West, 2 of which won the Stephen F. Christensen Award for Best Documentary from the Mormon History Association. Devery was the 4th History's Lunch speaker after we moved from the Winter Building over to these museums. He spoke on February 14th in 2018, but due to a conflict, we had to have that program in the community room instead of the auditorium. It's a pleasure to welcome him back and a pleasure to have him here in the auditorium. Help me welcome Devery Anderson.
All right, thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here today and to see all of you. And I'm excited to talk about this subject of this new book of mine that just came out, A Slow, Calculated Lynching, The Story of Clyde Kennard. And Clyde Kennard is a figure who isn't as well known as other figures in the civil rights movement, but his story is a tragic one, and it's one that everybody needs to know about. And so my goal in writing this book was to help him become a household name, is what I'd like for him, because it's important that he be. And this project of mine began on June 13th, 2017, as I was reading in the book Local People by John Dittmer. And it's about the struggle for civil rights in Mississippi. And he devotes a few pages to the Clyde Kennard story. And when I came upon those and read those, and he mentions in there that in many respects the Kennard case is one of the most tragic of the decade. And as I read the pages there that he devoted to the case, I knew right away that this was going to be my next book. It grabbed me in such a way that I wrote in my journal that night that I was excited because I now know what I'm going to write about next, and I'll look back on this journal entry a few years from now and remember this is the day it all began. It so happened it was the day after what would have been Clyde Kennard's 90th birthday. He was born in 1927. And Harry Belafonte, who just died yesterday, was born a few months before Clyde Kennard. And I think about that because they were both passionate and active in civil rights. One got to live 60 years longer than the other. And I think when life is cut short, so short, what a tragedy that is, especially someone who had such promise and was really destined for great things. And we'll talk about that here now. And hopefully during the course of this, I'll be able to explain a little bit more the title of the book. So when you look at Clyde Kennard here, especially this photo, a military photo, you see something that's important, I think. He served, he either joined or was drafted. His Army records aren't, not too many of them are available. There was a fire that destroyed so many of the records in 1973. But he did serve beginning in 1945. It was after the World War II had ended. But he spent time in Germany, and he, during the United States post-war occupation there. And he was assigned to teach children courses in denazification. He was just trying to unbrainwash them, basically, believing that they were the hope of the future. And he recorded a dialogue between himself and some of these students that I want to read for a second here. And I'll just read a paragraph ahead of that. Clyde was eventually deployed to the Education and Information Unit in Frankfurt, Germany. As part of his overseas stint during the United States post-war occupation, he taught democracy and denazification classes to the German youth organization, kids who had been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology, but who the Allied forces believed stood the best chance of rebuilding Germany after the war. This experience was an eye-opener for him. The kids were smart and wondered how he, a black man, could support American democracy. Some of these young people even defended the crimes committed by Germany. Kennard recounted their conversation. Quote, "Certainly Germany did it," they'd say. Quote, "but the United States does the same thing to the Negro. What is the difference?" And then Kennard answered, "Well, I'm a Negro from America. Here I am living with white soldiers, eating with them." And then the students responded, "But that's a showcase for people to see. What's it really like?" Kennard tried to explain that in Germany, quote, "the Nazi government decided on the treatment of the Jews. In America, the government tries to protect the rights of everybody. The things that are done to Negroes are not done by the government. They are done by individuals, and things are changing," end quote. It was instinctual for Kennard to defend his country in this moment, but he knew these young people had a point. Quote, "I sat up nights thinking about it. I decided when I got home, I'd try to do something about it," end quote. And one of the lessons he learned was that in his case, the government, the officials in Mississippi at all levels were out to get him and did everything they could to get him. So we'll talk about that. So who was Clyde Kennard? He lived in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. This is the home, that's his mother on the porch there. This is his home, and they had about 160 acres of land that they owned and farmed. And he took a portion of the land and began a chicken business. Owned about 1,500 chickens, and they laid eggs, and he sold the eggs to local businesses. This is his chicken house there on the property. And to give you a little feel for their property, this is the property today. The house is gone, but way up in the corner here, even beyond those trees, is where the house sat. And then the chicken house was way down here. And he said it was about a mile walk from his house to the chicken house. And that was his business. Now, he was befriended and mentored by Vernon Damer in Hattiesburg, who was several years older than him. But Vernon Damer was a local businessman, civil rights activist, who was quite influential on Clyde Kennard. They became friends, and he was one of those who really started him thinking about civil rights and those issues. One thing about Clyde Kennard, too, after he finished 4 years in the military from 45 to 49, he came home, moved to Chicago briefly, and earned his GED. And that was a turning point for him because he had always had an interest in books and learning. One of his childhood friends told me that he was always into learning and into books. But getting his GED, which he had to leave school to go in the Army, he just turned 18, but he hadn't finished school. So now he got his GED. He re-enlisted in the Army in 1950 to 52, and he was stationed in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and he attended the Fayetteville Teachers College there, which was a highly funded, well-funded, and well-respected black college there. So he got a taste of school. He went there for a couple of years until he was deployed to Korea, had to end his studies shortly before the end of the semester he was currently in, but he went to Korea. He was a paratrooper there. I think he did like 33 jumps in Korea, and he was in there until 1952. So he spent 6 years in the military and got his first taste of college life there. As I said, he was mentored by Vernon Damer. He also had a friend who was a Jewish. He was very friendly and supported by the Jewish community locally. Dave Madison was a local businessman who was a good friend of Clyde Kennard's. Also, a Rabbi Manton-Band who led the congregation that Dave Madison attended. They were both very supportive. Rabbi Manton-Band was active in the civil rights movement, had received a lot of death threats. Even his own congregation was starting to tire of him and his activism, but he was very supportive of Clyde Kennard. So he had some locals there who helped him and who mentored him as he was a young man and contemplating school. He was also a mentor later to the Ladner sisters, Dory and Joyce Ladner, who are still around and still active. But in 1952, he came back from the Army, and he worked at home for a little while. Then he decided he wanted to go back to Chicago, and he attended the University of Chicago there. And he lived with his sister in Chicago. And he was there for over a year. I think he was in his second year there when his stepfather had a stroke. And his mother needed help on this farm. They had, like I said, a lot of land. So he needed to come back home to Hattiesburg. But he wanted to continue going to school. And so naively, I suppose, he applied what was then Mississippi Southern College, which now is the University of Southern Mississippi. And he came up against William McCain, who was president of the college. He asked for an application. They sent it to him because they didn't really know who he was. But when he called and asked more questions, they realized that he was an African American. They started using any excuse they could to discourage him. Reason being, this was in 1955. The Brown decision had been handed down the year before, but there were other decisions, Supreme Court decisions prior to that, that affected specifically higher education. Many cases that to maintain the whole idea of separate but equal, these issues were addressed by, in some cases, someone who wanted to attend law school. Well, the state offered to pay their tuition if they would go somewhere else, but that violated this whole, the Plessy versus Ferguson case from way back, because white students didn't have to go, were never offered their tuition to be paid and to move somewhere else. And so these cases were won in the Supreme Court, but all the result of that was that that only resulted in the state doubling down and finding other reasons to keep black students out. So Kennard, by the time he applied, he had the law behind him, but he didn't have the state behind him at all. Medgar Evers was a test case after the Brown decision. He applied to Ole Miss Law School, and they told him his references were from the wrong city. He had moved, was working outside of his hometown, and they told him he had to have references from his hometown. And they did all they could to keep him out. When Clyde Kennard applied in 1955, they told him same types of things, that he didn't fill out his application correctly, he didn't have the right number of references. But the whole idea of having these references was to keep black students out, because you had to have references from alumni from that school, from your hometown. Now, a black student who wanted to apply, were they ever going to find 5 white people willing to vouch for them when they knew there would be a backlash and there would be repercussions from them doing that? And so that was a way to keep black students out, because you weren't going to find 5 people in your hometown who knew you that would be willing to put their reputations on the line and vouch for you. So you had to be an alumni. He asked if he could maybe use teachers he knew in Chicago there, officers in the military that he had known. Dr. McCain said, yeah, you can try, and we'll see if we can get permission from the board to allow those to stand. And of course, they never had any intention of allowing that to stand. So he was rejected in 1955. His application was denied. He didn't give up. He started inquiring again in early 1956. And then again, he actively became involved with trying to apply to the school again in 1958. By this point, he had come to the attention of Governor Coleman, J.P. Coleman, who was then governor of Mississippi. Not long before that, he had established the Sovereignty Commission. Sovereignty Commission was a spy agency really meant and formed to keep integration from ever happening. And so it would spy on people, it would try to find reasons to discredit people, dig up dirt on people, do whatever they could to lessen their influence and to get them to be quiet or to leave the state or whatever. Right away, Governor Coleman in December 1958 assigned the Sovereignty Commission to investigate Clyde Kennard. So they spent a few weeks, an investigator, Zach Van Landingham, and his son sent me this photo of his father. That's Zach Van Landingham, who was a former FBI man who was the investigator for the Sovereignty Commission. He spent a few weeks in Hattiesburg trying to dig up dirt on Kennard. He assigned another man to go to Chicago and see if there was anything on him there from when he attended the University of Chicago. He assigned another former FBI man to go to Fayetteville to see if they could find something out about him from his years there. They couldn't find any dirt. In fact, the correspondence in the Sovereignty Commission, Van Landingham is telling these investigators, well, keep trying. If you find something negative, let me know right away. And they couldn't. The only thing they could find was that his credit rating had suffered some when he got behind in some bills, but there was nothing, no legal issues. He's never been arrested, never been in any trouble whatsoever. In the Army, he was well decorated. At school, he did well. Nothing. They couldn't find anything. So they were getting desperate because they had to turn him down from the school, but they had to at least state some reason. And it couldn't be because he was black, because he could have filed a lawsuit. So they always had that worry hanging over them, that we have to do this and get rid of him, find a reason to deny him legitimately, because, you know, then we face the possibility of a lawsuit. Medgar Evers comes along soon and becomes an influence in his life because without him filing a lawsuit and without them having any real reason to reject him, after his final attempt to integrate the school in September 1959, he had his application filled out, he had done everything he was supposed to. They told him, well, you used an old application with a previous date on it, and you used the same form from your doctor that you submitted last year. We could see that it had the old date on it, but you wrote a new date down, and that's fraud, so we're going to reject you for committing fraud. Well, when they handed him his letter of rejection afterwards, and this was at President McCain's office on campus, he went out to his car to leave, and there were two constables standing there. And they told him that they'd been following him since he left his home in the Kelly settlement, that he was speeding, driving recklessly, and they couldn't catch up with him, but they just happened to be on campus and saw his car on campus and waited there for him to come out. They didn't know who he was, if he was a teacher. They didn't know who the car belonged to. He could have been there all day, but they decided to stand by the car anyway, is what they said, trying to make sense of that one. And so they arrested him. One of the constables drove his car to the jail. The other one drove Kennard in the back of the constable's car. When they got to the jail, they told him, by the way, while we were driving your car, we found 5 bottles of whiskey in your car. Mississippi was a dry state. Hard liquor was illegal. So they charged him with reckless driving and illegal possession of alcohol. And it was a justice of the peace court that he was tried in. When you read the Sovereignty Commission correspondence between Zach Van Landingham, the investigator, and President McCain, the local DA, others, they all knew, and they said, this looks like a frame-up. The Sovereignty Commission has often been blamed for framing him in this moment, but when you read their correspondence, with each other, which these were internal memos that they would have talked about it had they had plotted something. Van Landingham was upset because he said, this is going to be terrible publicity for us. Everyone's going to think we did this. The timing of this was terrible. They didn't object to him being framed, but they didn't want to get blamed for it. And the local DA knew. The correspondent said, yes, with him, he says, this looks like a frame-up. He called the sheriff's office, talked to a deputy there and said, this looks like a frame-up, and who did it? And no one really knew, but right away, I think it was the sheriff said that this looks like the kind of thing that John Reeder would do. John Reeder was head of security on campus. And so either he and the constables got together, maybe he assigned the constables to do this, or the constables came up with the idea and told him, but Reeder would have known about it. So who framed him, can't say for sure, but everybody knew that he was framed and nobody did anything about it. They all sat back and just let him go to court and be tried, and he was convicted. He was jailed, but he got out on bail, and when he got out on bail, he immediately drove to Jackson to the NAACP office there and talked with Medgar Evers. And from that moment on, he and Medgar Evers developed a close relationship, and Medgar Evers assisted Kennard from that moment on until Medgar's death in 1963. So that was an important turning point. So now it became a case where Kennard is stating publicly, people asked him, are you going to try to again, after 3 times, to go to the college? And he said, yeah, and if I have to, I'll file a lawsuit. So once those words, lawsuit, were uttered, then you can imagine what the campus thought and what the governor thought, what the president of the university, of the college thought, because they weren't going to win a lawsuit. The college didn't have to comply. You see what happened later with James Meredith. He won a lawsuit, and that's what got him installed, but it ended up causing the National Guard to come out and thousands of troops on campus in a riot and death. And so McCain said later that the reason he kept Kennard out is he didn't want the same thing to happen there. But McCain was a staunch segregationist. He was not going to integrate that school. He didn't want black students on campus. So whether it was a peaceful installation of Kennard on campus as a student or a violent one, he didn't want black students on campus, and that's what it boiled down to. So Medgar Evers and the NAACP became his support from then on. And there's a photo that I just had never seen. It exists in the Evers papers, but I saw it on the video in the Medgar Evers room here at the museum, and that popped up, and I'd never seen this before. And this looks like it was taken right around the time that he was out on bail and went to see Medgar Evers. So this was probably taken in around 1959, Clyde Kennard and Medgar Evers. His attorney was Jess Brown, NAACP attorney, and he took over and represented Clyde Kennard going forward. Now, a year later, he'd been talking about this lawsuit. He'd been convicted once. He was framed, and everybody knew he was framed. He was convicted, but he was still talking about this lawsuit. Then a year later, in September 1960, this man is Johnny Lee Roberts. This photo I took of him, that's my hand around my arm around his shoulders there. That was taken in 2019 when he was 78 years old. He was 19 years old in 1960. But in a early September morning, I think it was around the 24th of September, the exact day kind of slips my memory right now, but Clyde Kennard began his day like other days. He went out to feed his chickens, talked to some friends who were neighbors, and excused himself so he can get ready to go to Sunday school. And as he went back to the house, his mother told him that the police had been there looking for him. And he didn't know what it was all about, so he went around back to his chicken house, I believe, and then came back home, and then he saw the police parked outside on the street, and so he went to them and asked what they wanted, and they told him he was under arrest again, this time for orchestrating a theft of 5 bags of chicken feed from the Forest County Co-op. Johnny Lee Roberts, they said, had broken into the co-op a few hours earlier, around 4:40 that morning, stole the chicken feed, but told them that he did so at Kennard's request, and that Kennard told him how to break into the co-op. Johnny Lee Roberts worked at the co-op. He knew the place well. That's why he was in a position to take feed. But he said he did it, that Kennard directed him to do it, told him how to leave the back doors unlocked when Roberts left work earlier the day before, so he can come back and just grab the feed and leave. So the police arrested Kennard as an accessory to theft. A conviction in this case would have resulted in years of in the state pen, but it also would disqualify him from ever attending a public school again as a convicted felon. So, 2 months later, Clyde Kennard went to trial. It was a one-day trial, and it took the jury only 10 minutes to convict him. And he was sentenced to 7 years in Parchman for this $25 worth of chicken feed. They were $5 a bag, 5 bags. And the police said they found the feed in his chicken house, but they arrested him and took him to jail before they came back with a warrant and claimed they found the feed in his chicken house. So that began a new phase for him, twice convicted. Johnny Lee Roberts pled guilty and was sentenced to 5 years probation. He was the actual thief in the case. Kennard, who they said was an accessory, went to trial and was given 7 years hard labor at Parchman. Now this is the warehouse where Johnny Lee Roberts took the feed. Here's the door, that 2x4 that you see right there is the one he said at trial that he had left those back doors of the warehouse closed, and this 2x4 kept the doors, and it wasn't all that secure, but that's how they locked the door. He said he left those off, that 2x4 off the night before and shut the door so he could go in the next morning and take the feed. This trial happened, this is the DA who prosecuted Kennard, and this is the judge who sentenced him, Judge Stanford Hall. And this is a photo taken around the early 60s, so this would have been around the time Kennard was there, and these are black inmates working in the cotton fields, and that's what Kennard was sentenced to do, and these are what they called cages, where he would have lived in Parchman. Parchman was segregated back then, and these different segregated buildings were known as cages. And so that was his life, this brilliant student, great mind who just wanted to go to school and didn't stop, and the next thing, he's in prison for 7 years. Now, this is the prison superintendent, C.E. Brazil was his name. After Kennard was sentenced, he spent the first year in Hattiesburg at the county jail while his case was under appeal, and he lost his original case with the stealing or the possession of hard liquor. That one got overturned while he was in prison, and well, they ordered it overturned or vacated, and then he was supposed to go have a new trial. But since he was already in prison, it didn't go anywhere. So that one was basically over with and overturned. But while he was in Parchman, after a year in the city jail, he then was transferred to Parchman, and he'd only been there about 3 months when he started feeling he started feeling sick. This had started before, but even before he went to prison. After the conviction, his attorney argued that he should be able to be out on bail during his appeal process, because he told the judge he's been having a lot of pain, a lot of abdominal pain, and he has signs of anemia, and he needs to go to the doctor, and he needs to have a lot of tests done. The food he's eating in the city jail is making his condition worse. Can he please just be on bail out and at home to undergo these tests, until he's transferred to Parchman? And the judge said no, he wouldn't let him out. So he kept getting worse. A few months into his time at the county jail, a local doctor named Charles Smith examined him, came to the jail and examined him, and he felt he had cancer. He told officials, I think it's cancer, he needs to see a doctor, and they wouldn't do it. So after he'd been at Parchman, then later on, about 3 months in, he collapsed while he was working in the fields. They took him to the prison doctor. The prison doctor examined him and diagnosed him with colon cancer. he wrote a letter to the hospital in Jackson and said, as soon as there's a bed available, we need to transfer him to Jackson because he has colon cancer. Well, that doctor, turns out, still alive. I tracked him down, interviewed him a couple years ago, and he told me that Parchman at the time wasn't equipped to do much of anything. He was the only doctor there. They had a nurse and a dentist, but most of the lab technicians were convicts, were inmates there that had very little training, and so he could only do so much, and he wanted them to, take Kennard, and they did. And when they did, they at first in Jackson diagnosed him because they did some tests and saw that there were that he was full of parasites. And they thought, this really hard mass in his abdomen was a collection of parasites, which was true, but they thought that's what the problem was. So they gave him some drugs to clear that up. He came back a month later, still with the pain, but the parasites had cleared up, and so they did further testing and said, yes, he does have colon cancer. So they operated on him, felt they got most of it out. The correspondence between the doctor and the prison said, looks like he's okay for now, but there's a very good chance, obviously. You have about 5 years that it could reoccur. After that, it's rare, but they wanted to keep an eye on him, so they wanted him to come back quarterly to Jackson, to the hospital here for further tests. And they wrote to Ross Barnett, the doctor did, and recommended early parole for him because of his health. Ross Barnett said no to that, turned that down, but he said, but we want him to get better, so I'll make sure the prison superintendent allows him to keep all of his follow-up appointments. This man, Brazil, wouldn't let him go back for any more follow-up treatment. So he didn't get any more care while he was at the prison. In 1962, a young college student from the north named Ron Hollander came to Mississippi to help with voter registration, like a lot of students did. A lot of white northern students came down and helped Bob Moses. When he got here, Bob Moses found out that Ron Hollander wanted to become a journalist, that he wanted to be able to do some work like that in Mississippi, so he volunteered to work for the Mississippi Free Press in Jackson, and Bob Moses handed him a sheet of paper that said, that was titled, I think it was titled, Will Mississippi, Will Mississippi Trap Kennard, or something like that. And Bob Moses said, why don't you look into this case while you're here? So Ron Hollander rented a car and went to Hattiesburg and started working on an investigative piece that he wanted to publish in the Mississippi Free Press. Make a long story short, he went to Hattiesburg, spent several weeks. Those photos I took of Kennard, or I showed of Kennard's house and of the warehouse that Johnny Lee Roberts had taken the chicken feed, all those were taken by Ron Hollander in 1962. He interviewed everybody he could about the case. He went over to the Kennard home, interviewed Kennard's mother for a long time. He sent me, I interviewed him a few times for the book, and he sent me all of his notes, his reporter pad with all of his notes, everything, early drafts of his articles about Kennard, sent those to me, and I scanned them all and then sent them back to him. But they revealed so much. The closeness between him and Kennard's sister and mother, the letters between them and Ron Hollander were just gold for me working on my book, and I learned so much. But he was the one who got the case some recognition. He published a series of articles in the Mississippi Free Press, which didn't get a lot of circulation, and then it was soon overshadowed by the James Meredith case, because that case, exploded in the fall of '62, and that became the news. So the Kennard articles were really just kind of forgotten and just kind of overshadowed. But he kept working, and he eventually published an article in '62 in the Reporter magazine, which was had a large circulation. It was a national magazine, and he ran this article about Kennard and what was going on with him and the unjust way the fact that he was, even back then, people right away suspected he had been framed for in this chicken feed theft, but also how he was treated at Parchman, his illness and the way he was treated. Got national coverage, and Robert F. Kennedy was about to intervene, but others did kind of before him. This is comedian Dick Gregory, who heard about the Kennard case and intervened right away. He hired a lawyer. He gave money to Kennard's sister so she could come out and visit, supported them financially. He was a lot like when, Harry Belafonte, now in the news with his death, who was active in the movement and became wealthy at a young age and used a lot of that money to help and support, the King family and others. Dick Gregory did the same thing. He was known for flying in food to Greenwood during the Civil Rights Movement to help impoverished families, and he did the same thing for Kennard. So he was one who stepped up to do a lot. Then there was also John Howard Griffin. If you remember his book Black Like Me, where in the early 60s he, between tanning and taking some drugs and dyes and things like that, he lived as a black man for a while and moved to the South and then wrote a book about his experience living as a black man and how he was treated. Sold millions of copies. It was a huge, huge book, and it became a movie later on. I think James Whitmore played him in the movie. But he intervened to help Kennard. So between all of them, in January of 1963, Kennard's mother and sister came to visit him in prison. He had to have help walking out to the waiting area where they were. Another inmate had to help him dress and had to help him walk, and he had lost so much weight, his family just couldn't believe what they were seeing. They hadn't been able to see him in prison. They hadn't visited the prison at all. It was too far from Hattiesburg, and his mother didn't drive. But his sister came to town. Dick Gregory helped out there. They saw what had happened to him. His mother immediately phoned Medgar Evers after that visit and said, "He's dying. They're trying to kill my son, and if he dies, this is manslaughter," his sister said. So his attorney, Jess Brown, started working on getting him out, filed a formal complaint against the prison superintendent, wrote Ross Barnett. The pressure from Dick Gregory and John Howard Griffin started piling up. So Governor Barnett commuted his sentence and said, he can go home, but he has to be on his best behavior or else, he'll be back. And so that was the condition they released him. And here he is going to Chicago after his release from prison. He immediately went to Billings Hospital in Chicago, underwent more tests and treatment and surgery and that, but he did get to come home briefly. And he came home twice to Hattiesburg, once just for 4 days, and he got so sick he had to go back to Chicago again. And then he was in Chicago for a while getting treatment again, and then he came back home, managed to do a few things around the house. He went fishing once, he painted some lawn chairs on the front porch, but he was too sick. He went back to Chicago and entered Billings Hospital there. And here he is in his hospital bed shortly before his death. Now, I want to read a couple of things here. When he first learned about his cancer, he wrote a poem. And this poem was published in a newspaper, and I got permission from the family to include it in my book. But this is something he wrote from his hospital bed as soon as he learned he had cancer. He said, "Oh, here you come again, old chilly death of old, to plot out life and test immortal soul. I saw you fall about the raging sea. I cheated you then, and now you'll not catch me. I know your face, it's known in every race. Your speed is fast, and along the way, your shadow is cast. High in the sky, you thought you had me then. I landed safely, but here you are again. I see you paused upon the forward pew. When you think I'm asleep, I'm watching you. Why must you hound me so everywhere I go? It's true my eyes are dim, my hands are growing cold. Well, take me on then, that I might at last become my soul." And the words, "I landed safely," recalled his time surviving dozens of jumps as a paratrooper. His ocean voyages to and from Korea came with the risk of death when he exclaimed, "I saw you fall about the raging sea." But still, he declared, quote, "I cheated you then," end quote. Sickness had long ago weakened him, and the state of Mississippi had deprived him of his dreams. Now, not only must he contemplate the likelihood of an early death, but he also had to do it from prison. This was, when he was still in his cell. Thus adversity was his constant companion. That's why he exclaimed, "Why must you hound me so everywhere I go?" But he took this well, and if you know him, and anybody who knew him, he was always happy, he was always smiling. A few moments where he wasn't. You see this photo here. But he was never bitter. And his sister asked him, or someone asked his sister, why is he not bitter? Why isn't he angry about what they've done to him? He's been framed. He didn't get the care he needed, and he's dying now because they just ignored him. And she said, he can never be bitter. That's not who he is. And then on the day, on July 4th, 1963, he was eating his lunch, and his mother said, or he asked his mother, "Mother, how do you feel?" And she said, "I feel fine, Clyde." He said, "So do I, because the Lord is my shepherd." And then at around 2:30, his behavior changed, and he became delusional, which a doctor told me this indicates he may have been septic, which caused a decrease in the blood pressure that affected his cognition. And moments later, he slipped into a coma. Now, this is July 4th, 1963. A few weeks earlier, Medgar Evers was shot and killed, and so that ended his role in Kennard's life, and that was on June 12, 63, which would have been Clyde Kennard's 36th birthday. But he was in the hospital dying. He spent the last few months of his life in the hospital. But that evening, after Clyde Kennard slipped into the coma, and I'll just read a little bit here. That evening, the NAACP held its annual convention 10 miles away at Grant Park. The organization awarded its 48th Spingarn Award posthumously to Medgar Evers, which his widow Merle accepted on his behalf. She told the crowd that nearly 200 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, blacks remained in bondage. Attempts to right wrongs only through pronouncements held no meaning. "This is not enough," she said. "These actions must be in the form of deeds and not just hollow words." She spoke about how her husband labored tirelessly in Mississippi. "He stood for justice and freedom for all, equally under the law of man and God," she said. "To be fully aware of the dangers in store for you from the hands of your fellow man, and yet continue with the work that has produced this very danger, shows how important he felt this work to be." As a large gathering in the park honored Medgar Evers, Kennard remained unconscious. The nation was at that moment remembering its beginnings. For a group of black citizens at Grant Park, however, this was not just about declarations and wars of yesterday, but also about conflict still being fought, blood still being shed, and freedom, a concept too many still died for, even on American soil. With that theme so prevalent in the air, Clyde Kennard died at 8:55 p.m. Leona, his mother, and his sister Sarah were by his side. So that was the tragic ending of Clyde Kennard as a mortal, living, breathing person. His friend, Rabbi Mattenband, who I showed earlier, after Clyde's death, he wrote his mother to express his condolences, and he reminded her, quote, "Your fine son Clyde was our good friend and a frequent visitor at our home. I must have told his sad story 100 times in many parts of the country." And then he assured her of something else. Quote, "Someday, when the history of the race trouble in Mississippi will be documented and written, the name of Clyde Kennard will be high on the list of heroes and martyrs." End quote. And so that was his prediction, his prophecy in 1963. Here's his grave at the Mary Magdalene Church in Hattiesburg, where he was a member, where he had taught Sunday school, where he sang in the choir, directed the choir, did so much. In 1965, the university integrated, just 2 years after Kennard's death. William McCain knew he couldn't put it off much longer, and so Raylani Branch on the right, she was Raylani Adams then, and Gwendolyn Armstrong were the first two black students to integrate the University of Southern Mississippi. They were assigned bodyguards, but Raylani told me that we didn't need them. It was quiet, people treated us well, and nothing happened. So that was 1965, just 2 years after Kennard's death. In 1993, now that's 30 years between his death and this moment. It's another 30 years has now passed. When you look at 1993, try to picture that being 1963. and then 30 years to me, which feels like it went by in no time at all. But the university named a building after Clyde Kennard and Walter Washington. So the Student Services Building is now the Kennard Washington Hall. And it's important because one of the presidents, former presidents there, Aubrey Lucas, told me, and he was the one who handed Kennard his letter of rejection back in 1959. He went on to become the president, and he's the one who approved this building being named after him when he was president in 1993. But he said this represents, named after the two men, an opportunity denied and an opportunity granted, because Walter Washington was the first black man to receive a PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi. So one was denied, one reached his dreams came true there. And then in 2018, this marker was placed there. In 2020, or then later that year, the university awarded Clyde Kennard an honorary doctorate at a time that the university had its first black president. And this is Aubrey Lucas, the former president, and who was director of admissions when President McCain directed him to write a letter denying Kennard his chance to go to school. And this is Eddie Holloway, who was dean of students for a long time, retired and just returned to the university again. So this attempt to right some wrongs was all symbolic. Clyde Kennard was gone. But Mississippi had a lot of healing to do. Hattiesburg had a lot of healing to do. The university had a lot of healing to do. So they named a building after him and they gave him this honorary doctorate. But there was still an issue of his conviction that had stood. In 2006, Jerry Mitchell interviewed Johnny Lee Roberts, and Roberts told him, Clyde never did anything wrong. He never asked me to steal. He had nothing to do with this. And so that made the front page. It was the Clarion Ledger as well as the Hattiesburg American in 2006, if any of you remember that or saw that. And then shortly after, Johnny Lee Roberts gave a sworn affidavit to a couple of attorneys and a judge, and he said the same thing. Armed with that, they sought to get Clyde Kennard posthumously pardoned. It was a long process because Governor Haley Barbour felt he didn't have authority to posthumously pardon anyone, is what he said. And even though other governors had done it, even Bill Clinton had done it, so at the at the federal level and the state level, there was precedent for it. But several people, including Judge Pickering, former Governor Winter, went to Governor Barbour and asked him to pardon Clyde Kennard. He wouldn't do it. So eventually, and it took several months, but eventually the judge of the circuit court, Judge Bob Helfrich, Judge Pickering put together a petition that Governor Winter was on board with. Even Governor Barbour at that point said, yes, he's innocent. This conviction needs to be overturned. I just can't pardon him, is what he kept saying. So he signed on to the petition as well. And then in May of 2006, in the very same courtroom where Kennard had been convicted for stealing chicken feed, the judge overturned that conviction and he was officially exonerated in May of 2006. A lawyer named Richard Barrett tried to get it reinstated again. He was a white supremacist that eventually was murdered himself, but 2006 he was still very active. He tried to get that reinstated. The state Supreme Court eventually ruled and said he had no standing, and Judge Helfrich's decision stood. The judge told me, he said, I didn't really have authority to do this. There was no precedent for me to be able to go in the way that he did it and overturn that. But he said, if nobody appeals it, who's to say it's not the final deal? And that's what happened. I mean, they did try to overturn it, but because he had no standing, Barrett didn't, it got to stand. And the Kennard exoneration has since been used in other cases as precedent to overturn some other convictions too. So now it stands as a case that has been used for that. So again, Kennard is gone, but the universities honored him, the state did what they needed to do, but it was a healing. Kennard was never bitter. He knew during his lifetime that people cared about him, people loved him, people were reaching out, raising money for him, doing what they could. He knew the people were behind him. Mississippi had to do this for its own sake, for its own healing. And this is one case where people all along the spectrum, politically, there were liberals and conservatives that got together to get this done. Pickering, very staunch conservative. Governor Winter was liberal. They got together. Students, black and white, here in Mississippi and in Chicago, put petitions together with signatures, doing all they can. So all these people came together decades later, and it was the same offices that, the governor, the university president, local law, DA, all these people that were against Kennard, all those offices, obviously the people had changed in 50 years, but those same offices came together to undo that, to try to make a right out of a wrong. So, as I said, he's gone, but it was something that had to be done because symbolically it meant a lot, and it did a lot. And I think it's helping, that something like that helps the healing process. And so, with that reason, I saw, well, there's a happy ending here, as happy as it can get, under the circumstances. The suffering he did, you can't undo that. And I'm not saying this brings closure by any means, but it was a group of people coming together to do what they could. And I think that's one of the reasons I became so fascinated with the story, because it didn't end in '63. It kept going until 2018 when he got his honorary doctorate. So thank you so much. We'll have time for questions now, if you have some. So we have about 8 minutes. I talked a little longer than I wanted to, or should have.
I'm Ernest McBride with the Jackson Advocate. I spoke with you.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Cool.
We noticed that the white, perpetrators here in Mississippi seemed, after the fact, put on the cloak of innocence and excuse themselves for not speaking up at the time that they should have. But yet we put their names in the history books as having done some heroic action, and we tend to obscure the victims, such as Clyde Kennard. His name is not well remembered today, but we have the same thing happening now. The president here just resigned last year from USM because Tate Reeves and some of the other state officials are trying to reimpose the Confederate values on the state. And just as the other day, they celebrating Confederate History Day or whatever. Mm-hmm. Well, I just want to say, what about this hypocrisy that's seeping through? You said there was a happy ending, but I wonder, is that a happy ending as long as you have these hypocrites who can come back into office and pretty much wipe the slate of any noble activity that has taken place in the past?
Yes, and when I say happy ending, I'm not talking about to the racial situation. And I'm not even, and as I mentioned, you can't bring closure, but it was an example of people from all groups that normally don't work together coming together in this one case. And that it set an example, meaning that we can keep doing that. It tells us that people can work together, that there are certain causes that every heart should feel a need to do something about. But we're so divided that those hearts are stone cold very often. So no, there's a lot of work to be done. This is happy in the sense that it was one time where, people did come together, but we need to see more of that. And I'm hoping that this can stand as an example for others to follow. I'm hoping we can see more times that people get together. But yeah, no, the racial situation, there's not a happy ending to that by any stretch of the imagination. We got a lot of work to do. I just hope we can point to examples to show something can be done sometimes. So. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, we haven't talked, but we did fist bump.
Yes.
Thank you so much for writing the book. I'm interested to know if he was poisoned while he was in jail, because they did have access to him and they were determined to get rid of him or cripple him in some way. Is it possible that he was poisoned?
I know according to his niece, she was like 8 years old when he came home from prison and was at home for those few days before he went back to Chicago to the hospital. She remembers him telling his mother that he thought that they had poisoned him. I can't say, because her later memory of him, but he believed so. And he believed he was in a situation and disliked enough that he didn't put it past them. So that's all I know. And one other person asked me that once, that very question, if I thought he was poisoned. That was before I talked to his niece. But when she told me that, I thought, oh, wow, maybe. But I couldn't, in the book, I just mentioned she said that and that he believed that. But I didn't elaborate because I'm one of these that needs to have a smoking gun, something that would tell me. But it doesn't surprise, it wouldn't surprise me one bit. And he's not the kind that he never said a bad word about anybody, ever, under any circumstance. And everybody who knew him said he would never say a bad word about anybody. So for him to even accuse the state, even though he knew he was framed, some of his correspondence when he was in jail, he's just as optimistic as he can be. But for him to say that, he would have thought that out well. It wouldn't have been just some impulsive thing that he thought. He's the kind that would have thought that out very carefully before he would have ever made an accusation like that. So that gives it some strength to me, but I just didn't have anything else to go by. So yeah, it's...
DNA proof would send who to jail? If you were to find out now, doing DNA
now, I don't know who, now everybody's dead, but Johnny Lee died 2 years ago, Johnny Lee Roberts. And my interview with him, I came away with more questions than answers in a lot of ways. I felt he was contradicting himself to me from stuff he had said in other interviews later in life, and so I still didn't really know exactly why he set Kennard up, or somebody had to have had him do it. And he kind of started to tell me a little bit but not enough, and he wouldn't elaborate. So anyway, it's in the book too. At the last chapter, you might find that interview with him frustrating, but.
Mississippi is still alive.
You said Mississippi?
The state of Mississippi.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, those states.
But if there's anybody left now, when I talked to Judge Pickering, and I asked him, was it common for like a DA? Because they asked him, Johnny Lee Roberts, during his testimony, did anybody offer you something in return for your testimony today? And he said no. And Johnny Lee Roberts was, he was a very young, and he was very illiterate, and he was mentally, at least they portrayed him as being kind of slow. And I thought, would he have been able to be coached the way he was? And I asked Judge Pickering, he said it wasn't uncommon for a DA. Maybe they wouldn't come out and say, if you lie for us, we'll give you this. But they would tell him, well, things could go a little better for you if you just, and kind of give a wink and a nod. And he said that was very common. And so the DA could have done something but framed it in such a way when he asked him in court, did we promise you anything? No, we didn't promise you, but things will go better for you if you just stick with the testimony. And one of the things Ron Hollander learned when he interviewed Kennard's mother was that she said that Johnny Lee Roberts' brother Lonnie told him before the trial that some men came and got him to practice. And he said, in fact, they just came and got him again last night. So he was coached by somebody as what to say in court. So he had a couple of months to learn some lines and to learn what to say. So, but he's gone now. And anybody who was part of the trial, who would have been all the police, everybody's gone. But had Johnny Lee Roberts come forward decades earlier, and had a DA been, or the local law courts been willing to take it on, even 20, 30 years ago, might have been a different story. They might have been able to get somebody else who, but I don't know, since it wasn't a direct murder, would there have been a statute of limitations on framing him or on doing this? I don't know the law well enough to know if anything would have stood all those years later. But
The White Citizens Council, I don't think you mentioned them.
the
White Citizens.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, and this is another thing. Yeah, I didn't have time, but Dudley Connor, who was I think he was head of the Citizens Councils in Hattiesburg, he told the Zach Van Landingham, the Sovereignty Commission investigator, that what we need to do, and this is him telling a state official, former FBI man, what Mississippi needs is a good lynching in the Kennard case. And he talked about a plan to possibly put dynamite in Kennard's car. And he just casually tells this to Van Landingham, that so they would have been willing to go to any extreme to get rid of him. And I think by him, had he have persisted in the lawsuit talk And had they not found a way to frame him, I'm sure they would have killed him. At some point, he would have been killed. In fact, his house was shot at one night. I couldn't go over it because I want you to read the book, but one night his house was shot at in the middle of the night. And one of the police that he called, one of the ones that came over, was one of the constables who later planted the whiskey in his car. So they weren't all that willing to help. You know, they were trying to get rid of him. Why would they help a guy whose house has been shot up for trying to, you know, integrate, when the cops are about ready to frame him for doing that very thing? So he had everything and everybody against him. So, yes, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Marion Allen of the Laurel Jones County Black History Museum and Arts. And I was instrumental in getting a historical marker for lynching in Jones County for John Hartfield from 1919. Where do you think we should begin in order to, like you were talking about, exonerations? Where should one begin to have this gentleman's name exonerated from that, even though he didn't even go through a trial because a mob came in and got him and lynched him on June the 26th of 1919. But I did have that historical marker placed there by the Division of Archives. But I'm just, you know, wanting to clear some of the air about that, and where would you suggest one began?
So in his case, you said he didn't go to trial for anything because he was lynched before.
Yes.
So, I mean, any lynching victim who's denied due process, that needs to come out. I mean, the fact that, it's hard to, in his case, what you have to do there is just try to restore his reputation, I guess. So is there enough known about him where something can be written that gives another side to whether, because is there question of whether he even did, is there good evidence that he didn't even do what he was accused of that caused him to be?
Yes, because there's been stories written, books written, articles written. The NAACP got involved and wrote the governor about this situation beforehand. So we're talking 1990. But I'm just saying, I felt the duty to marketplace. At least people know, because a lot of people in Ellisville, Mississippi, didn't even know this happened. And so when the gentleman gave me the pictures of the lynching, I just felt that he should be recognized. And that's what me and my team went about, getting the recognition that this did happen. And so there is a marker to say lynching of John Hartfield in Ellisville, Mississippi.
Because, that's the thing, with lynchings, they're all tragic, because even if someone was guilty of a crime, just like every American, you deserve your day in court. You deserve a trial. People can't just take the law into their hands. So right away, if there's a lynching involved, right away there's a wrong there that has to be stated that he wasn't given that. But if the evidence is there, if there wasn't a trial and there wasn't a conviction to overturn, they have to have their lives explained in a marker or in a book or an article that gives another side where people can read it and come away thinking, oh wow, there was more to this man. And that's the kind of stuff in a case like that, that's really all you can do. But that stuff goes a long way. It can really go a long way.
Because there are two lynchings like that where both of these gentlemen were taken out of the jail, John Hartfield and Howard Wash. So Jones County, we have two lynching victims who were, removed from the jail.
Okay, yeah, tragic. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. I know that there are probably more questions than we had time for, but the good news is Devery's going to stick around for a little while, sign copies of the book, which we have for sale over here, so you can talk to him, ask a question then. Come back tomorrow if you get a chance for History Happy Hour. Come back next week for History's Lunch when Davis Houck will be with us. Don't forget about the excellent exhibit upstairs. For now, help me thank Devery Anderson for this program.
Thank you. Thank you.